I agree, and this like got me into trouble with people who with my fans, I guess I would say. I agree. I mean, with my family who says that Trump would be worse, but what I definitely, well, my mom and I have like the same politics. But in
Hmm.
terms of what I know is going to happen is that Bernie Bros are going to be blamed in my like extended family, and so I'll have to just like agree to disagree with why Trump lost. Why, excuse me, why Trump won.
So let's get into it. Why did Trump win? Because my big takeaway, frankly, from this is that because Kamala Harris received 15 million fewer votes than Joe Biden did in 2020, and Donald Trump managed to win with 3 million fewer votes than he had in the last time around, that it's very difficult to attribute this to anything other than the Democratic Party's failure to turn out its own base. As much as I would frankly love to take credit for it as a Green Party voter, and to demonstrate the power of the Green Party, it's hard for me to see this as anything other than the Democratic Party failing to excite its own voters, failing to get its own voters. What do you guys think?
Said you take it away. I defer
Yeah,
to
I
you. Go
mean,
first.
I mean, okay, so I'm not an expert in every part of the country. So, that's part of why I was like 50-50 about this election, because I knew that Trump would win this region of the country. I knew he'd win on the whole Sun Belt because I know a lot about it.
And just for the audience's sake, Zed, you're talking about coming from Georgia.
Yeah, yeah, I live outside Atlanta. And so like I knew that. I didn't really understand the Midwest. I'm not 100% sure like what its structural leans are and stuff. But anyway, so when I looked at the results, I think yeah, part of like what you were saying is part of it. Like the Democrats did not hit their turnout targets at all in like parts of, south of Atlanta, so on and so forth. And that certainly contributed to their loss. On the other hand, Trump's not an incumbent this time, although I guess he kind of is because he used to be president. I don't really know how you would rank him, but because he was an incumbent in 2020, that probably boosted his turnout somewhat as well, just naturally. And so the fact that he wasn't this time might kind of explain the fewer votes, if that's what ends up happening. I know we're still counting votes. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is like a friend of mine made this point that when you have a Democratic primary, right, you get a chance to stress test the candidates, but you also get a chance to like just figure out who your base is, like who are your voters, like who are they literally, like what is the composition, also like what do they want. And that never happened with Kamala Harris, right? Because they hid Joe Biden's condition all the way through late summer. Once everybody figured it out, the cat was out of the bag. They're like, oh crap, we got to replace him. Some party leaders wanted to have a mini primary. I don't know how that would have worked, but that's not even what happened. They just installed Kamala Harris, right? Harris was not stress tested in any way. And the Democrats lacked the opportunity to see what like their national presidential base might look like what their voters were demanding, who they were, where they were turning out, the composition, so on and so forth. And so I think they spent a lot of this like last month of, or maybe more long than that probably, trying to court like a Bush, like an older like Bush Cheney voter that really doesn't exist anymore, right? Like Trump like kicked them out of the party, or they transitioned them into his team. They don't really exist anymore. And a friend of mine here in Georgia who's been involved in politics here, he was telling me for weeks, because he was also skeptical of this strategy. Look, I think the swing voter in this election is actually like a young minority person, and I think he was
Mm.
right. Right? I think the turnout numbers suggest that he's correct, and also some of the persuasion numbers. I think the fact that Trump boosted his Latino percentage of the vote from 35% to 42% counts for that. AP Votecast suggests that he boosted his black support two times from 2020 to 2024, largely focused on black men. I think in Georgia, the survey, the exit poll suggests a 16%. Of course, that's not 100% like, legit because it's an exit poll. But I think all those things account for the fact that the Democrats kind of ended up chasing voters that don't exist anymore or are not really gettable.
Yeah, I think
And
that's
I
a
think
really, yeah, go
they
ahead. I'm
took
sorry.
and they kind of depressed slash persuaded a lot of their camp to go in the other direction. Because I don't know. I think that they kind of looked at, I think Democrats kind of look at minority voters as like mobilization voters, right? Meaning they're all on their side, but like they just need to like make sure they're not apathetic or forget when the voting day is, blah, 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 do GOTV with them. But the reality is that they're also persuadable voters. A lot of minorities did not like what Democrats were selling, right? So they either stayed home, they voted third party, or they voted for Trump, right? And all three of those things are bad outcomes for Democrats, right? Either one of those things is a problem for them, right? So I think that's kind of what happened. That's my initial take. I mean, as we get more data over the days and weeks, it may change a little bit, but that's what it looks like right now to me.
I appreciate that, and I think a lot of what you said just there resonates with me. Is that That was Zaid Jilani, independent journalist, formerly my colleague at The Intercept. We also have with us today Malaika Jabali, just joining us in the chat. Welcome, Malaika.
Hi, Briahna. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Also an independent journalist, author of It's Not You, It's Capitalism, and someone who I really wanted to be a part of this conversation because she, I think, gave the most insightful take back in 2018 after Trump's first win as to what was going on in Wisconsin, particularly with some shifts that we were seeing with Black voters, and actually spoke to them, something that wasn't happening a lot in the media at the time. And I think probably can offer some more substantive assessments of what is driving the voter trends that Zaid just alluded to. And rounding out the panel here today is podcast favorite Katie Halper, hardest working woman on the left, host of the Katie Halper Show and Useful Idiots. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be talking to you guys. Such
All right, Katie,
smart people.
This is a dream lineup for me. Katie, I want to give you an opportunity to weigh on anything that Zaid said, but then also perhaps give your impression of what the mainstream media takeaways seem to be in these first 12 to 24 hours after the election.
Yeah. Well, something I'll say that I noticed, and I didn't know who was going to win. I think my friend, I remember actually it was a couple weeks ago, and I was texting with people, one friend, she asked me about Trump. At the same time, someone else, while I'm texting back and forth with her, asked me who I thought would win. And then a chat I'm in with 3 people also had the same question. And every one of them said Trump. And I was like, oh, I guess, yeah, it's going to, I mean, if all these smart people think Trump, it very well might be him. At the beginning, I was like, Kamala Harris is a terrible candidate. She did terribly when she ran. This is a terrible decision. It's terrible that they covered up Joe's, cognitive decline. Then after the debate between Kamala and Trump, because I thought that Trump was kind of the Biden of that debate, like he seemed out of it and cognitively not all there. I was like, sure, she could actually win this. And then I thought that for a little bit afterwards, but then his attacks didn't really land. I mean, because his attacks weren't landing at first, but then they started to land, I think. And apologies, by the way, I'm very sick. So apologies for my voice. And also if I'm not as sharp and focused as usual. But what I remember thinking was that all of the messaging from the Democrats was stuff that hardcore Trump haters would respond to, but anyone who didn't already hate Trump and love the Democrats would not leave the house. Over.
Yeah, I think it's an important point. And that aligns with something that Zaid was saying. Also, this sort of Cheney-ification of the Democratic Party, whatever you think of the debate about whether the Democratic Party should go more to the left or more to the right, Democrats have to contend with the reality that they put all of their effort into flipping these moderate voters, these voters that Chuck Schumer famously said, if we can flip these kind of affluent housewives in Connecticut, we can lose all of these Bernie bro working class voter types.
Right.
The reality is that in the 2020 election, 94% of Republicans voted for Trump. And in the 2020 election, 24% of Republicans voted for Trump. There was absolutely no movement on how people who identified as conservative actually voted. What's going on? I mean, like, are we really going to sit here and have a whole nother cycle where we have a debate in a very 2016, 2017 way about the merits of moving right? Malaika, I'll go to you.
I think we're at a turning point. We don't know. I think we thought that maybe 2020 or 2016 would have been the turning point. What is it really going to take? The Democratic Party doesn't really stand for anything as party leadership. As you talked about the chainification of Kamala Harris's campaign, on one hand, she's appealing to her identity, her experience in HBCUs, being a Black woman. And so she was frequently going to Wisconsin. I felt like every other weekend she was in Milwaukee. And so the ground game was there. The engagement was there. But what are you engaging people on? If these are multiple celebrity rallies, but you're not really going to the Northwest side or the North side of Milwaukee, which is where a lot of Black working class people have been having complaints, and they've been talking about the economic anxiety that they're experiencing, you're sending mixed messages. When you say that you have a strategy and you have policies for Black men, but you're talking about cryptocurrency, most people, that is so obscure. I think she was really kind of like what they're doing with the suburban, like Philadelphia voters that they've been talking about. They were doing that with Black men and focusing on a very niche group of them. And so if you talk to some organizers kind of behind the scenes, they're organizing for the Democratic Party, so they're not going to really say it on record. They will say she is not addressing the working class enough. So there are multitudes within the Democratic Party, and I don't think you can take any of them for granted. You know, you got the bougie Black folks, you got the progressive white folks, but if she's also, you know, making sure that she's talking about the most lethal fighting force in the world, are you getting the progressive white voter? And there's a lot of that in the Great Lakes. You know, I think like Zaid said, it's going to take some time for us to actually figure out what happened in these battleground states. Wisconsin actually had a higher voter turnout for Kamala Harris than it did President Biden. So I don't think it was necessarily voter enthusiasm. I just think Donald Trump energized more of his base. And so how will the Democratic Party do that on mixed messages?
Zed, you mentioned, oh, sorry, Katie, do you want to get in?
No. Yeah.
Zed, you mentioned that we quite obviously didn't have a primary, that Kamala Harris was anointed, and that there might have been an opportunity, if there were a primary, to get a better sense of what the electorate actually wanted. But let me ask you this. Do you really think, I agree for kind of democracy reasons that should have happened. And I think that there are certain intangibles in terms of who just vibes with the public, who might have been more popular. It gives the public a chance to get to know a candidate better and all of these other sorts of things. But I do wonder about this idea that Democrats don't know what's actually popular absent a primary season. It does seem to me like the choices that were made as to what kind of campaign Kamala Harris ran, the position she wasn't willing to take a position on, the extent to which she spent the first month of her position as the top of the ticket, basically hiding from the media. Those were all choices to not run or not have to weigh in on topics which are considered to be polarizing by centrists. But in reality, perhaps are just not what the donor base wants to hear. Do we need a primary to know that Kamala Harris shouldn't run on cryptocurrency and Dick Cheney?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that it would have made it a little bit more obvious, right? Because there would have just been many more opportunities for voters to interface with the candidates, to actually vote and demonstrate their appeal and their power. I think like the crypto issue, like if I remember correctly, what happened with that was there were a lot of crypto people who didn't like what Biden was doing and like what his FTC was doing and so on and so forth. So they started like threatening Kamala, like, oh, we might support Trump. So then they got spooked by that, and they decided that they're just going to kind of be neutral to positive on crypto, and that's probably how it ended up in the blackmail platform, is for them to be able to please, you know, both parties at the same time. These people with crypto money and maybe some black guys who own crypto, although I don't think they probably don't own that much. It's probably not a huge amount of money and versus their assets in their homes or whatever. And yeah, so I think part of it's that, but also part of it's like, I don't think that Kamala Harris, like, okay, there's this documentary called Our Brandis Crisis. Have you guys seen that?
Yeah.
I haven't.
Yeah, so Katie's seen it. So Our Brandis Crisis is about a Bolivian election. And it was actually the first election, I think, that Evo Morales ran in, but he didn't win that one, but he like overperformed. Anyway, a bunch of American consultants went down to Bolivia, including James Carville, and they worked for like the neoliberal, like Democratic Party equivalent candidate. And at one point, Carville's interviewed, and then they're like, you know, so how do you do it? And he's just like, well, I just go with my gut. Like, they pay me a bunch of money to do this, but I just go with my gut. Like, he's like, all these polls and everything, they don't really matter. Like, that's kind of like Kamala Harris's main problem, is that like she just lacked an intuitive understanding of like what the American electorate actually is and what it wants, I think, right? Like when she was asked on one of those late shows if she would have done anything different from Joe Biden, she couldn't think of anything. And I'm like, come on. Like, I think if you pulled an average Republican or Democrat off the street, they could give you both of them could give you a long list of things they thought Biden did wrong.
And then when
Kamala Harris didn't have that.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Katie.
No. Well, I don't want to cut you off.
Oh, no, I'm done. I'm done. Go ahead.
Well, and then when she was pushed on what would be different, it was that she'd have Republicans in her cabinet. I mean, does she think that excited anyone in the base? And also, Republicans who don't like her aren't going to be impressed by that either. Like the Republicans who like Trump, it's not like they're going to be like, okay, because those are Republicans who don't like the Republicans that she would invite into her cabinet.
They
anyway.
Probably thought it would be Liz Cheney, right? Like,
yeah, exactly, right.
Which they don't care for at all. So like, who did that win over, right?
Yeah. And I also think that something that Trump always has up his sleeve is that he has total license to be hypocritical and inconsistent, because no one expects him to be coherent or consistent. which gives him the ability to go after people's inconsistencies and hypocrisies without being subject to that judgment himself. Because he's out there kind of about being like, I don't know what, a wild card. He shoots from the hip. He says what he wants. And so when he calls out the hypocrisy of his opponent, the opponent looks like a hypocrite, but nothing that they will say about him will stick to him.
Well, also they just don't call out Donald Trump on the kinds of inconsistencies that I think would actually matter to his base. Liberals consistently criticize Trump for things that liberals care about. Oh, he's so orange. Oh, he's a racist. Oh, he's in politics. Like, the stuff is
but
true.
Not like the way he treats the working class is where they could go with it. And that's what they should be going with.
Exactly. Or, you know, he said he was going to bring these jobs back and he didn't. He said he was going to drain the swamp and he didn't. You know, he escalated in these ways in the Middle East and now he's trying to pretend to be a peacenik.
Right.
On that point, I do want to stay with you for a second, Katie, because going into this, our argument was that especially because of the concentration of Muslim and Arab American voters in key Midwestern states, that Gaza was potentially a determining factor on the outcome of this election. From what we've seen so far, despite the desire to kind of instinctively blame Jill Stein for the Democratic Party's loss, the kind of margin reads that I've seen so far don't have Jill Stein actually flipping, you know, the number of votes that she's gotten in no given state would have been determinative for the Green Party. Determinative for the Democratic Party.
Right.
And maybe that will change. I did see it was close at one point in Virginia, but that not, and I saw Zaid, you weighing in on that a little, saying that as much focus as there was on Muslim voters in Michigan, there's also a significant population in Northern Virginia that Democrats didn't weigh in on. Didn't attended to.
Yeah, I think, well, Michigan in particular is interesting because it has a very large Asian American population. So it had people whose families were intimately caught up in Lebanon and Gaza and West Bank and so on and so forth, right? So like there was some reason for them to focus on that, but also Virginia, Northern Virginia alone has like 250,000 Muslim population, right? And so like when I saw there's like Northern Virginia counties being kind of soft for Kamala, I was like, well, that might just explain that, right? Like I'm not sure it was defense contractors who were voting against Kamala. I mean, maybe they actually were the few people in America who liked Liz Cheney's endorsement. It most likely was like immigrant communities and people who were tied to Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, so on and so forth, who I think probably dropped off in that state. In my state, Muslim voters are the second largest religious group now. I think they're about tied with Jewish Americans, maybe a little bit more. And my guess is that contributed to her loss with respect to the margin here. And in Michigan, I think, you know, if we're talking about like 200,000 plus Muslims and, you know, certain percentage of them are voters, the margin was, and then I think there were like 80,000 plus Lebanese Americans. I'm sure that also contributed to the loss of Michigan. The issue though with saying that these people defeated Kamala though, is that every minority group shifted to the right, pretty much, right? There was a large Latino shift, a smaller but real like black shift. And so like all that also contributed to her being defeated, as well as I think probably depressed turnout among Democratic voters. So, you know, I don't think you could say that this issue alone cost her or defeated her because of the other shifts, but it was also probably large enough to where it would have defeated her even if she did a little bit better, right? So like it was significant in that sense.
I mean, it is difficult because we saw the stats that show that in 3 key swing states, had Kamala Harris supported an arms embargo, there was basically voters were 30% more likely to vote for her than they otherwise would have been. It was all upside, no downside, right? It was like 30 plus more likely to vote for her, single digits less likely to vote for her. Still, so much of the commentary coming out of this is that I'll dig up the clip on MSNBC if I can find it and stick it in here for the listeners, but that the Democratic Party was inattentive to Jewish voters, and that is part of what caused the loss.
And I think there was this very powerful ad, the Republican Jewish Coalition, that was all over the airwaves. Yeah. A bunch of women sitting around, Jewish women, just saying, I can't stand him, but I felt like we were supporting Israel and we were stronger and we were tougher. And I think that resonates with people.
And then to your point, the ad that came out that was beating Kamala up around fear about Israel not being protected. There was never a response from the campaign on that, which I thought was a big mistake. Amanda Berman from Zioness had to raise money, run her own ads trying to fight back alone. That didn't work. So, but listen, you tied her to the economy, you tied her to Biden, you tied her to weird, and it was not a good enough
I
response.
agree with everything you're saying. I just didn't want to engage in the autopsy before before we've called the race and before she dropped out. But one thing on that, the answer on I can't think of anything offhand about where she would differ with Biden was disastrous, and there's no doubt about it. The question is what motivated it, and whether she just felt she did not want to.
Loyalty.
Yes,
Basic
loyalty. And so she should have just said, "Look, I'm grateful to him. I'm proud of many of the things we did together, and I'm not going to critique him. I'm talking about the future." Would have been a better answer, but it's easy to be on the sidelines.
And here is the take from a friend of the show, Richie Torres. He said, Donald Trump has no greater friend than the far left, which has managed to alienate historic numbers of Latinos, Blacks, Asians, and Jews from the Democratic Party with absurdities like defund the police, or from the river to the sea, or Latinx, all phrases Kamala Harris was known for using frequently. There is more to lose than there is to gain politically from pandering to a far left that is more representative of Twitter, Twitch, and TikTok than it is of the real world. The working class is not buying the ivory tower nonsense that the far left is selling. Katie, I see your brow very, very much furrowed. Is that the real problem here? Does Richie Torres have his finger on the pulse? Did Kamala Harris, who billed herself as America's top cop, as California's top cop, lean too far into defunding the police?
I mean, I'm just like furrowing my brow because I can't get over the fact that they thought it would be a good idea to send Richie Torres to Michigan and also to send Bill Clinton to Michigan and then have Bill Clinton say what he said in Michigan. I mean, my theory is that the Clintons are bitter and didn't want anyone besides Hillary Clinton to be the first female president. So they sabotaged her campaign, Kamala's campaign.
What percentage of that is a joke, Katie?
It's a joke. It's mostly a joke. But although I am surprised because Bill Clinton, I guess in his older age, he's gotten less success. He tends to be pretty Machiavellian and shrewd. But he hasn't been, I guess, for a couple of years. But I mean, that kind of told you everything you needed to know about the Democrats' approach to these voters. It was chiding. It was out of touch. It was racist. I mean, it was really, really racist. It was self-absorbed and self-aggrandizing, making it seem like Bill Clinton had saved the Palestinian people and they were a bunch of ingrates who didn't realize that it was Hamas's fault that Israel is genociding people and targeting civilians. I mean, I think what's so fascinating is that you have someone on Twitter wrote last night, like, I went from being told that as a third party voter, I went from being told that my vote didn't matter and I was like powerless to being blamed for the election. And what's interesting is we're seeing people without the data to back it up, blaming the loss on third party voters. I mean, they don't really care about what the data is because these people they're, as Aaron Mate calls them, blue anon or blue MAGA. They're like they're conspiracy theorists who don't need any evidence of anything. And I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it's disgusting that these tweets from people basically saying, can't wait for Gaza to be turned into a parking lot. Like, I can't wait for you Palestinian voters who voted for Jill Stein to lose your families, or can't wait for you like Mexican American voters to be deported. Even I saw you respond to this, Zed. David Korn tweeted about maybe like the deportation will affect how these voters look at Trump. And I believe he was talking about Latino voters, right? Was that the
Well, yeah. So he was responding to a exit poll of, I believe it was Michigan and maybe another Midwestern state that showed that Trump won Latino voters in that state, right? And
which also shows how out of touch he is with Latino voters. I mean, they're not a monolith and they don't have the same opinion on deportation.
I mean, it's strange. Just like, what do these people actually think about these people and these issues, right? Like, is it just a matter of like these people in the Democratic Party pretend to like these groups because they think they're vote banks for them, right? Like if Latinos if the Latinos became a GOP bloc within like 10 years, a solid GOP bloc, would they just be like, screw those people? Like we don't like them anyway, right?
Yeah,
like,
100%. Yeah.
They're voters. They're voters. They're American. They voted. Why are we talking about deporting them? It's fundamentally racist. What's wrong
exactly.
with these
They see
people?
them all as a monolith.
Like,
they see them all as like not every like Latino voter is politically progressive for many reasons, and not every Latino voter like identifies with people who are undocumented. I mean that shows you how he has this like total fantasy view of what Latino voters
are. And it's a very working class population for the most part in the US, meaning inflation hit them much harder than, many other populations. And I think it was very, very disruptive to their families, to their work life, so on and so forth. And I remember my friend Daniel Marin's at HuffPost, I think mutual friend of a couple of ours, when he went to Pennsylvania in 2020 during that presidential election, there was actually a Latino vote boom for Trump then, too. The state was very close. He talked to people like, why are you voting for Trump? And a lot of them just said, hey, look, the economy was good lately for us. Like we felt better, like we could do more with our money and, help our family. Like a lot of people just have very basic concerns like that, right? And like, here's people talking about deportation. I mean, that's not even in the minds of a lot of these people. It's like they're citizens, right? They're voting. They're not. That's not even like on the radar for them. A lot of them, they're worried about their health care, about whether they can make ends meet. Take their family on nice vacations, just like any other American, right? But like the Democrats are so good at segmenting people, and they just have a hard time seeing it that way, right?
Micro-targeting.
I want to add to that because I feel as if there are a lot of voters who they're going to have these economic concerns. And the problem is that the Democratic Party has not really allowed themselves to move left on them, and so as an average person, if they say, I've got an issue with healthcare, I'm not able to make ends meet, I'm not able to afford my rent, I am not able to even buy a home nowadays. If those positions we know are just, bread and butter issues, why has the Democratic Party not just made their messaging simple? We don't need to be talking about whittling down to prescription costs, even though that's important. I mean, and let's be real, like Donald Trump, when he was asked about a healthcare plan, he said, I have concepts of a plan, and so in a capitalist economy, people are going to be feeling the brunt of it, most likely regardless of who the president is. But knowing that, why not just try? Like, why not just attempt to have a populist economic message? Because the only presidential candidate that we've even had this century that has won without doing that was Joe Biden. And that was a lot of backlash to Donald Trump's incumbency. And
COVID,
just going back,
I think.
You say that again?
And COVID. I have very big questions about whether he would have,
and so just thinking about Richie Torres's comment, she was being, using these phrases and doing things that were too niche and far left. I mean, defund the police, however we want to argue about it, during the defund movement, that's when the Democratic Party had an increase in voter registrations. So I think this attempt to try and malign leftist positions and not actually embrace the leftist economic policies clearly is serving the Democratic Party wrong.
Also, nobody was saying defund. I literally, when I read that tweet, I was like, wow, it's been a solid year since I've heard anyone even utter those words. At least a year since I've even heard in my ear canal the words defund the police. Joe Biden ran on funding the police more. He did increase, police funding did increase under his administration, and more people were killed by the police under his administration. That's the reality. And I'm so glad you brought that up, Malaika, because I remember, and this is for you too, Zed, as our Georgia expert here, I remember watching an interview, I think on what was Cornel West's podcast that he had back then with some organizers from Georgia. And they were saying that basically they had expended all of their political capital in getting people out and winning the state for Joe Biden in 2020 and then winning the congressional races. And that they had knocked all the doors they could, they had made all the promises they could, and that they were getting pushback from folks about feeling misled about the $2,000 checks, and that they weren't going to be able to knock on those doors again unless the Democratic Party conferred some material good. And I keep thinking about that interview today because it wasn't just that some, younger lefty voters might have been upset about student debt, or they might have been upset about Gaza and might not have voted for the Democratic Party. It's also that that's the core of the machine that knocks doors, pounds pavements, and gets votes out for Democrats historically. And I do wonder what kind of effect demobilizing that sector of the population might have had on the actual outcome.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. It's not 100% obvious with the information we have now in terms of like what the takeaway should be in terms of who voted. I just out of curiosity, I looked at some counties, see what counties are moving which way, so on and so forth. And, like in Georgia, a lot of the Democrats' margin is based on like the people Chuck Schumer was talking about in that quote you mentioned, right? Like affluent, suburban, upwardly mobile professionals, blah, blah. And so to give you an anecdote, like I drive around Atlanta all the time for various things. And so like I really didn't see any Harris wall signs until like a week or two ago, probably when the campaigns were pushing them really hard. But that was one exception. Like there was one place where I actually saw a bunch. I was at Emory Hospital, near like Midtown Atlanta, and I was driving through a neighborhood, and it was, probably like surgeons, anesthesiologists, doctors, like multi-million-dollar mansions. And there was like the whole like carnival and circus of like Harris Waltz signs and, like custom stuff and like, that kind of apparel. And, it kind of shows you that like the Democrats, in terms of the realignment that's happening right now, that is really their like most vociferous and like adamant base of people, right? It's people who are very culturally attuned to the Democratic Party. And those people can carry some elections for sure, right? Like I think that it's not false that Democrats have won some elections thanks to having like upwardly mobile suburbanites on their side. But it can only really get you so far, right? It can't really build you a coalition that can pass substantial legislation. It can't really show up when you have someone on the other side who can mobilize a larger coalition. Like, for instance, like Trump is like a rural turnout king, right? Like he just massively increased turnout in all kinds of like South Georgia counties, which are a big part of like the Black Belt, right? But those people didn't show up in the same way because Democrats have not brought them into the coalition and made them as enthusiastic and as excited as like those folks near Emory in Midtown Atlanta. So, I think that as these parties like create their coalitions, I think a lot of Democrats got kind of cocky, right? Like they were thinking, okay, we have like well-educated, like urbane, like white folks and like college educated, upperly mobile Black folks, and like that's our coalition. And because they tend to be kind of jazzed about politics and highly educated, they will turn out in a lot of these lower turnout elections. And that's true that there were a lot of like special elections or like off-year elections where Democrats kind of had an advantage because of that. But it wasn't the case when Trump's at the top of the ticket. Right. Trump knows how to turn out infrequent voters like nobody else, right? And his coalition is his like coalition is actually fairly impressive and strong, and like stronger than I thought it would be this year in particular. And against that, you're like upwardly mobile suburbanite college educated people is not enough, right? Like they don't really stand up against that because Trump has pilfered a lot of working class voters, pilfered a lot of minority voters. He actually did fairly well among young voters in a lot of states. I mean, that was remarkable. I think a lot of Democrats didn't even realize that would happen.
To what do you attribute that? I'd like to talk about that for a second, because that really is, I think, in a lot of ways, the biggest news story. The trends with respect to various ethnic groups have been there for a while. I actually don't think it's mystifying at all what's going on with Latino voters. We saw a lot of interest in Bernie Sanders from Latino voters, for instance, in 2020. The Democratic Party fundamentally did not care that he was able to shore up a population that the Democrats absolutely need to win. And the anecdotal evidence as to the why was largely about healthcare. I forget, was it you, Malaika, that brought this up? Latino voters are the most underinsured group in the United States of America. And when you ask what's going on with Kamala Harris in healthcare, I saw someone point out that she was asked by a voter at one of these town halls about what she should do. She had suffered a health problem. She was homeless, and she wanted to know what Kamala could do to help. And Kamala brought up how if she were president, medical debt wouldn't impact your credit score. So I don't know that that was going to cut it. It does feel like a sort of it's the economy stupid story. Steven Simler, friend of the show, has been tweeting out a lot of really interesting stats on this. He tweeted out some stats demonstrating how significant food scarcity has been for all of these people, as the Democratic Party was telling them that actually inflation was getting better and the economy was good. So I want to come back to you, Malaika, because I am really interested in what you were hearing from Black voters on the ground in Wisconsin as to why they were potentially feeling ambivalent about the Democratic Party. And was the economy stupid a big part of that narrative?
Sure, but there were different phases, because I had been following different canvas groups in Wisconsin or specifically Milwaukee, that are going door to door to voters. Many of them in, public housing developments or working class Black communities. And for them, there are, even the working class is varied. So there were elders who actually appreciated the fact that the Democratic Party was talking about, like I said before, lowering prescription costs. But you might have younger voters who are not thinking about that. They may not even care about healthcare that much. They just want to feel like they've got some economic security in a general sense. They want to feel like if they're working a job, that is enough to be able to pay rent, and they don't have to pay, they don't have to work multiple jobs in order to do that. So it was kind of a mixed bag, and most of it was under Joe Biden. And so I think there are a few things going on here. And one of them is the fact that however we think about the candidates and their efficiencies or their mistakes, the parties as a whole, they have different types of ground game. And so the Democratic Party was going door to door. They were paying for their PACs, but they're thinking, I think, a little bit more traditionally. The Republican Party, the GOP, they've got an infrastructure that is online. And so when we're talking about younger people, a lot of younger people are online. A lot of them are not watching Fox News. They're not watching cable broadcasts. They are consuming chauvinistic podcasts. And so we should be factoring in the fact that there really is a gender and culture war that is playing out in the media that younger voters consume and that a lot of Donald Trump voters consume, regardless of what he says. He could have been on the debate stage talking nonsense, and he basically was. And so I don't want to make this too much about, and we can. There's so much to nitpick about what Kamala Harris said or didn't say, but Donald Trump said and did worse. But when we look at, again, kind of the ground game and what the infrastructure is looking like, the Democratic Party is just really behind in getting those messages out in an effective way to the people who need to hear them to excite them. And I don't know if going door to door, because I was hearing it, but we don't know if people are actually going to come out and vote based on that and if they're going to be excited enough about that.
Katie, does the left need our own chauvinistic podcasts?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, we're going to be blamed. We're already being blamed for this. I think that it's stunning because one of the things is that they did make a choice, right? I just had this article right up here. Matt Karp had a great piece in Jacobin, and he talks about how Harris won voters with college degrees by 15 points, a larger margin than in 2020. Voters making over 100,000 a year swung toward the Democrats in record numbers. And I think that really relates to something that Nina Turner articulated in 2016, and of course got into a lot of trouble for it. But she pointed out that both Trump and Bernie, in the case of Trump, it was fake. In the case of Bernie, it was authentic, but they both presented voters with the idea that they felt your pain. And I think that, and Hillary didn't, was Nina Turner's point. And you see the same thing this time around. Like, even though Kamala Harris tried to play up like, I'll work for you and he doesn't care about you, about Trump, you didn't get any sense. And this is not something you can quantify, although I'm sure someone could do an analysis actually of her speeches. So yeah, you can, but maybe it's more qualitative. You didn't get any sense that she had any like finger on the pulse of people in pain. You didn't get any sense that she related to anyone's anxiety or anger or frustration or struggles. And of course, Trump does speak to people's pain and anger. The difference between a Trump and a Bernie is that Trump says you're in pain, you're angry, you have every right to be, and blame, I mean, to some extent he says this, but blame Mexicans and Muslims. And then Bernie says blame, greed and corporate welfare. But I do think that if you were struggling, I don't think Kamala Harris came across as someone who really cared about that or really related to that.
does anyone really dispute that or have any pushback for that? I mean, I found the stat, by the way, from Steven Simler. Household food cost increased 35% since 2020, from a little over $6,000 a year to $17,242 a year. That's extraordinary. That's an extraordinary increase in a basic cost. And the dissonance that has to happen within an individual when you're experiencing that in tandem with rising housing costs, insurance costs, all of these kinds of things. And being told by the Democratic Party that everything's okay, actually, and everything's getting better, even if by some global economic metric, things are getting better. That's incredibly disrespectful. That has to be a jolt to the system. And then I guess the subsequent question is, okay, why did Kamala Harris choose that approach? It did seem at a certain point that there was more of an interest in defending the Biden record, even though they got a get out of jail free card and swapping out the nominee, than actually using that pivot to their advantage and addressing these kind of concerns. Go ahead, Zed.
I mean, I think you're right. Like okay, I was in a swing state, so I got ads every time I went on YouTube, and like 90% of Trump ads were probably immigration, 10% were tax cuts. But there were also some really interesting ads that I thought were fairly effective. When Kamala did go on that late night show and said that she wouldn't have done anything different from Biden, they used that to tie her to Biden, right? And most people, I think Democrats included, thought that was a bad answer, right? But like, what if the reality is like she was being 100% honest? What if like literally Kamala Harris didn't know anything she would do different from Biden, right? Like, what if it wasn't a political calculation, but like she couldn't think of anything because she's just not that interested in governing, right? She's 60 years old. Through her entire political career, I can't think of like one really good idea that she's had that's been sticky, right? Like I can, for most members of Congress who are high profile, I can think of something they really devoted their life to, something they moved or changed or are known for.
Going after those truant kids is the only thing that comes to mind.
I mean, literally, you have to go back to her DA days to find something that maybe was a little bit different. But like, I think part of it is just that she was a huge lightweight, right? Like she, compared to the other Democratic presidents we've had, she just is not that capable. And like, I think there's a little bit of a taboo in the Democratic Party against questioning her intelligence or capability, but like, I don't care. Like she isn't. Like most people know that.
Zed, I like you. You're like, I'm an Indian man and I can criticize this Indian woman if I want to.
Exactly. And they kept, look, I mean, I think they had an interest in portraying her as having the same social background as like Jesse Jackson or Shirley Chisholm or something like that, but she's not. Like me, she's a kid of immigrants. And her parents were quite brilliant and well-educated, but I think
her dad's a Marxist, right?
I think she just fell pretty far from the tree, though, right? Like she didn't have the same capability to approach governance or politics or talk about these things as I think so many other politicians did, as like, let's say, a Barack Obama did, right? And that's just like, it's just a huge error. Like somebody like that should not have been chosen as vice president because Joe Biden could die at any time, right? I don't think Kamala Harris could like negotiate international agreements or like preside over Congress and think about congressional strategy to move major bills just because she's never shown capability to do it. And also, not only capability, but also like interest, right? I think if you're someone who cares about politics, like everyone on this chat does, it wouldn't be that hard to like do long form interviews. You wouldn't be scared of talking to Joe Rogan for 3 hours. None of us would be. We all have a lot to say. We all care about things.
Don't have us all on. Have any of us on.
We're all thirsting for the opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But like Harris, it's just very, very hard for me to think of Harris as someone who cared intensely about governance. I'm not entirely sure why she even got to the position that she was in. It's just like almost as an accident, right? I don't think she ever really intended to be in this position. And to be fair, partly that was because of what Biden did with the deception about his personal state.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if we want to get into a conversation about mental acuity with Donald Trump as the opponent. I think overall, the Democratic Party was between a rock and a hard place because at the ninth hour, when it was clear that Joe Biden was on cognitive decline and everybody could see it, who would they actually want to choose at that moment? And so for Harris to have stepped up, I think temporarily there was this idea that this might be she could be a change candidate just purely based on identity. And she was getting those numbers. Those numbers were coming in. The more that she fell into the status quo, I think is where we started to see her campaign falter, so to be able to come from she made sure to call this a Biden-Harris administration when she was the vice president. So there's really no way of being a candidate and saying, actually, everything that I did already failed. So now I'm going to pivot. I don't know how the Democratic Party or Kamala Harris really would have thrived in this kind of environment. And the problem really, again, is sort of structurally and institutionally within the fabric of the Democratic Party. It's too little, too late. Whatever she probably could have mustered in the ninth hour is too late after you've had 40, 50 years of third way politics. After you have pushed candidates, most of whom have not won based on that kind of politics on a presidential level. You've got Bill Clinton and Joe Biden, who won for various reasons. The lessons that they gained from 2020 was that we need to get even more centrist or conservative and Republican, instead of we need to actually deal with the issues that people came out of exit polls saying that they wanted, like single payer healthcare in South Carolina, of all places, in their primary. That's what voters said that they wanted. So I think it was largely too little, too late. Again, I don't want to insult Kamala Harris's intelligence. I don't know her like that. And it's, again, especially with someone like Donald Trump, who talks about concepts of a plan and comes up with gibberish, and he was clearly the old man in the election.
I don't know though.
Okay.
I do think Trump actually has some more like hobby horses in terms of governance than she does. Like I think Trump is obsessed with tariffs because like he read a Ross Perot speech or maybe he went through a Pat Buchanan book at some point. Like I actually do think he probably has more convictions than she does, and that's saying something because I agree with you overall. He doesn't have that much in the way of conviction about anything, but I actually do think he's a little bit more interested in governance than she is. And like, I get that sense almost immediately. I've only interviewed her one time when she was in Congress.
Oh, wow.
Like I got that sense very, very strongly from her. And it is disappointing. And look, I'm empowered to say it. I know all the weird progressive racial fixations, but like brown people don't do that. Brown people, like we just call each other dumb if we think we're dumb, right? Like, I'm sorry, like we do.
Yeah.
Like her mother was brilliant. Like I used to read interviews with her. I think this cat is crazy smart, but like
so Zed, you're basically saying your parents would not be happy if you had been engaged.
Oh hell no! For brown people, if you go into politics, first of all, you're known as dumb because you got to go be a lawyer or you got to go be a doctor. She was a lawyer. She was a lawyer, but she went into politics, right? She went into being a Senate and everything. And like, look, she's
a failure like us, Malaika.
No. Everyone on this chat is much smarter than Kamala Harris.
I will say she doesn't.
I think Briahna's brilliant.
I would say that despite going into law, yeah. No, I would say that. What I will say is that, and this is something I always thought with Trump Biden versus Harris. Like, I do think Biden is more of an ideologue than Harris is, and I think Harris is more of an empty vessel, kind of. Which is why I never knew how she would be in comparison to Biden on Israel. I mean, I think she wouldn't have been better, but it would have been for different reasons. I don't think she's an ideological Zionist the way Biden is and the way he tells us that every 2 weeks. But I do think she probably is because of donors.
I think that's class
right. Would have done
it doesn't
the same thing.
Make any difference.
Right, doesn't make a difference. Right. Yeah, but that is something that's interesting. That I keep thinking about how all the people who are beating up preemptively on Palestinians, Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, imagine if they had pressured the person running to actually call for a ceasefire, or had pressured the person running to actually say she was going to do an arms embargo, which we know was incredibly popular. Now, one thing I will say is that we don't know what the effect of the cost of that would have been. Like, we know the benefit would have been gaining a lot of popular support. I don't know what the cost of it would have been. AIPAC would have gone after her. But I think
we kind of do know what the cost of it would have been. I mean, look, we know from a polling perspective that the voters were 100%, overwhelmingly more likely to vote for her.
Right.
And AIPAC, while can play an outsized role in these congressional races where spending $2-3 million completely swamps the other side, Kamala Harris already had $1 billion.
Yeah, I think it would have. I think the cost would have been outweighed a lot by the benefit of it. But I think that it is interesting that, and it just goes to how you guys, we've been saying this kind of throughout the show, but how entitled the Democrats feel to votes, and it's not on the candidate to change their position to win votes; it's on the voters to change their position.
Guys, though, it's even simpler than that, though. Like, you guys were debating like the niceties of Israel policy. She never said that, like, look, if you elect me, there'll be more peace in the world. I'm going to help bring the wars to an end. But if you elect Trump, there'll be more war in the world. He's going to expand the wars, create more bloodshed. She never even just said that. And
I agree. I think we actually have a clip to that point where there's some mainstream news hosts kind of exasperated about how many of these conservative voters are the peaceniks now.
I think if you are trying to find a single reason why Donald Trump has overperformed with younger voters relative to past elections for Republicans, I think the divide I see in polls around foreign policy and the role of America in the world is no longer a left-right divide. It is a younger-older divide. If you are under the age of 40, you don't remember a time when America projecting its power in the world led to anything good. And so Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, when they get up and they talk about, warmongers, and they sound like they're Code Pink people from 2004. We've had a complete inversion of the way we talk about America in the world, the use of the military, et cetera. It's totally a generational divide, and the parties have completely flipped.
Well, just one small thing to add to that. I was really struck at the Madison Square Garden rally. You had the Republican crowd cheering for people criticizing the Patriot Act and criticizing the Iraq War, which the RNC had been held at Madison Square Garden just 20 years before.
Yeah, right. Code Pink or Code Red.
Oh, yeah, right. Or brown or Code Brown. For the Red Brown Alliance. But anyway, and what was the response to that anti-war desire, which is bipartisan in terms of voters, not the party leaders, but the response to that was for her and Liz Cheney to criticize isolationism.
Mm-hmm.
That's their response to it. And
100%.
Trump was totally right to be to call out how gross Cheney is. Now, the thing, this is Trump in a nutshell. When he was debating Joe Biden, and this speaks to the power of Trump. When he was debating Joe Biden, Joe Biden said, the only people who want this war to continue is Hamas. It's not Israel. And Trump is like, what are you talking about? Israel wants to keep fighting, and they should finish the job. Which is one of those moments I like to keep track of, which is who said it, Trump or Chomsky, because it's something that you could have imagined Chomsky saying, Israel wants to keep fighting. But the takeaway from Chomsky would not have been they should finish the job. The takeaway from Chomsky would be like they need to end the occupation. But that is like a perfect Trumpism. He says this truthful thing that nobody will admit, and then also has a terrible idea. He. Along with that truth-telling moment, it's not that Israel needs to be stopped. It's that they need to go full on. And yet, even though he said stuff like that, he was also able to, because again, his get out of jail free card is his lack of consistency. He was able to spirit himself as the anti-war guy.
Finish the job was interpreted by some people as meaning you only have so much more time to do whatever you're doing. So
as opposed to
an abbreviation to the suffering, right? Like a ceasefire. Like there's going to be a sooner end to the bombs being dropped and the massacres happening under Trump than under. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying he tends to talk in those kind of squishy terms.
I think part of it is just Trump doesn't care that much about human rights. I think that's pretty obvious, and he's not a pacifist. But also, I don't think Trump tolerates BS as much, right? If Trump for some reason started to think the war in Ukraine was bad for him, he'd just be like, yeah, we're going to end it.
He's an opportunist. He's an opportunist more than an ideologue.
We're not sending any more guns next month. Or the same thing with Israel. The Abraham Accords are his legacy, right? Yeah. He wants to put more countries in there, and he loves all these Gulf Arabs. And if MBS calls him up and it's like, dude, we can't do any more deals because of this stupid war, Trump will tomorrow be like, okay, we're cutting him off. I think Trump actually thinks like that. Whether that happens or not, I don't know, because it depends on all the external factors and how Trump interprets them. But that kind of no nonsense attitude, I think a lot of voters do kind of respect it, and they know it's not always going to be pointed in the right direction. But it's like a leadership quality, right? I had no idea what Kamala Harris was going to do on any of these foreign affairs things, because she just was quoting the Atlantic magazine all the time, right? She was quoting what somebody else says, right? She didn't have her own ideas, which is why I think she's dumb, and she is dumb.
Well, I think we
do. The average politician, probably.
I think regardless of if she's dumb, I'm going to get into one of these conversations like I had with Norm Finkelstein.
Oh, by the way, I got to jet. It was so good talking to you guys, though.
Thanks, Zed. Thanks for spending time with us. Do you want to tell anybody where to find you on the internet before you go?
Yeah, I have a newsletter. It's called The American Saga. You can go to theamericansaga.com on Substack. So check that out.
Okay, terrific. Thanks, Zed.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, I want to come back to something Malaika was saying, sort of on this point about the kind of maybe first order mistake being picking Kamala Harris as VP 4 years ago. And I want to kind of remind us all where we were and how that happened, having come out of a primary where she was a very different kind of person, where she was running as an alleged progressive alongside Bernie Sanders, like the entire field was. as I remember it, Amy Klobuchar was really high up in the running for being VP, but then it turns out she's the one that let Derek Chauvin go back to the force after some other incidents of police violence. And when George Floyd protests popped off, that became a political non-starter. Even though Kamala was a cop, she's a Black cop, so she was seen as sort of filling the role in the right way. And it does seem like there has, for the entire time of her tenure in politics, her life in politics, a kind of blindness about her, like a myopia about her not really standing for anything, having run on anything, having kind of defined herself in any way. And so, Malaika, when we were kind of talking about, how can she distinguish herself from Joe Biden? Was it already baked in? She really didn't have that much of a choice. I recall her having to do this once before, having to distinguish her position vis-a-vis Biden before, when she joined his ticket. Because in a very famous interview with Stephen Colbert, he asked her, how did you basically go from saying this man was a segregationist who made you bus all around the city and ruin your childhood?
That little girl was me.
Yes, that little girl was me. And you sold T-shirts off it to being a part of the ticket. And she says, it was a debate. Katie.
It was a debate. Sorry.
and like that, those three words were enough for most people to accept that, hey, politics is politics, and now she's shifting gears. So why couldn't she have said politics is politics and shifted gears and really embraced the brat era and kept that sort of energy up and the benefit of the doubt she was given when she first took over from Joe Biden, instead of weirdly sort of bear hugging him as he was bear hugging Netanyahu and every bad fiscal policy that the country had already turned on?
I just don't know how she could have. I just don't know how effective it would have been when you've got the Republican Party that has been tying her to Joe Biden for these past 4 years. So every mistake was assumed to be her mistake. And any victory she also wanted to claim. So I don't know how she's going to be able to, pickpocket and say, these are the good things that came out of the Biden administration. We had Build Back Better, the infrastructure bill passed, and to say, well, actually, I wasn't involved in the fact that we didn't get student debt cancellation. So I'm not sure how she would have been able to do it effectively when the Republican Party has been tying her to all of the failures and she wants to assume a lot of the successes as well. She probably could have rhetorically done it. I'm not saying that she literally could not have done that. I just don't know how effective it would have been at the ninth hour. So I think fundamentally it's about how we ended up with these two people in the first place. The fact that we had somebody like Joe Biden, who the Democratic establishment rallied around to begin with. I hate to say that I don't know how much could have changed based on what has happened or what happened 4 years ago, but I just don't know how much could have changed because we shouldn't have been here in the first place. We should not have had a Joe Biden who was stumbling in all of those early primaries until Barack Obama gathered these Democratic centrists around like the Avengers to make sure that Bernie Sanders didn't win the primary. I think in another universe, we would have been on the tail end of two Bernie Sanders terms and a different electorate that feels more positively, or at least they've got more of the language to be able to talk about what's really happening to themselves and not blaming other people. So, this is not about excusing Kamala Harris. It's about saying that the Democratic Party made a mistake by having either of them on the ticket 4 years ago. And these are the F around and find out. Like, these are the consequences of that. And I just don't think 3 months before the election is enough to shift gears.
Okay, then how about this? One, if you don't think that 3 months before the election is enough to shift gears, fair enough. But there is a possibility that there was a primary, an abbreviated primary 3 months before the election instead of just an anointing. And then the alternative universe that we're imagining here is one where the Democrats didn't work so hard to suppress the primary and actually treated it like a real open primary, said Joe Biden is willing to debate because of the unprecedented historical nature of his age, or because he just simply admits, hey, I'm not going to run for a second term, a year and a half ago instead of 3 months ago. And we had over a year, just like the Republican Party, not just to have a vetting of a candidate, but to have space in which the Democrats could be talking about and seeding the air with actual ideas instead of, coconut tree emoji vibes.
Right. I think that could have been valuable to both get those ideas, to figure out what the Democratic Party wants to stand for and to actually push for that. And I think it's also, it needed to be consistent with a Democratic Party that says that they care about democracy. So they spent, much of Joe Biden's candidacy talking about bringing back democracy, and that this was a campaign and a presidency about democracy, but they didn't really have it for their own Democratic base. So for them to not be hypocrites, I think it would have been important to do that. And there might have been some value in seeing what voters actually care about. I guess I just don't know, who would have come out of that primary. Like, I mean, I'm asking you too, like, who do you think?
Oh, there's a whole world of fantasies. I mean, in 2020, there were 24 candidates in the Democratic primary. And now in 2024, we're sitting here saying, gosh, I can't imagine who would ever run in a Democratic primary. So first and foremost, it should be noted for the record that Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson did run in the Democratic primary. So there's two already. You can say what you want to say and think what you want to think, but they did run. Moreover, you had people that the Democratic Party used to at least feign excitement over, like Cory Booker, like Julian Castro, people who were young, people who were diverse, people who could conceivably lock in with some of these constituency groups that have, fled the Democratic Party like rats on a ship. Not to mention, terrible people who I obviously hate, like the billionaire cohort, the Michael Bloombergs and all of them. But I can't even think of who they were now, but there were definitely there's all of these young Ossoffy types. There was the Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren. There were all of those people. I know. Katie's grimacing. I mean, yes, I feel the same way, but the idea that we could not have populated a Democratic primary is beyond strange credulity,
Right. No, I think we could have and should have. I'm also wondering the effectiveness of it in terms of who would actually come out and be successful, because the bottom line is we want somebody who's a formidable challenge to Donald Trump. And I think here's the other issue is we're doing this as, I think we would all consider ourselves leftists, socialists to a degree, maybe more left than that. We are having these conversations. Is the Democratic Party leadership having these conversations? I think there has been such a lack of self-reflection over the last, 30, 40 years. I mean, they wanted to push Hillary Clinton over Barack Obama. Barack Obama swept the Great Lakes, probably to the chagrin of the Democratic Party establishment at the time. So he didn't even get the support of Democrats. Now he's the kingmaker of them, but when he came out, he didn't. So over all this time, are they the ones thinking about what they need to do to move forward? And I don't think that they have. I don't know if they will.
Yeah, this is a really good segue to a kind of a bigger picture question I want to ask the two of you as we wrap up here, which is, what is next for the left? What opportunities does this moment bring? What kind of challenges does it present? I did a radar. For those of you who don't know, I've been trying to recreate the radars over on a new Substack called Briefly. I'm calling them debriefs. And I did a debrief, I think last week or the week before, arguing that no matter what, the Democratic Party is not going to be pushed. That's not why we should be talking about Gaza and making arguments about how the Democratic Party should move, because I do think making those arguments helps educate the public about the degree to which the Democratic Party does not work for them and why they should abandon the Democratic Party. But I harbor no illusions about the Democratic Party actually being pushed, because I think they take the positions that they take because they're paid to take them. That being said, we're already seeing this kind of backlash response from so many of the usual suspects in the mainstream media, in which they're arguing that the Democratic Party has moved too far to the left somehow, and that is why Kamala Harris lost. And so that being the environment, a perfectly predictable environment, the environment that we had in 2016, 2017, and the environment we have now, what's next? Katie, how are you feeling about all of this? Like, are you feeling optimistic? Is this an outcome that's better than another outcome? In
some ways, I have to say I was very torn, as people know, because I actually think that in the short term, I believe the world will be worse under Trump. But I don't know about the long term. And I don't think that this drip drab of saving the world is not going to it's not going to achieve it on time. So we're in, I mean, this is an existential crisis that one party is addressing in a slightly more, I don't even want to say urgent way. One party is half-assedly addressing and maybe the other party not addressing at all. And in a weird way, there's something maybe like more people will suffer right now. I would say under Trump. And I'm very aware of how much I'm not someone who is dismissing the international for the sake of the domestic. I mean, I'm taking this into account, obviously. But the Democrats aren't viable. So maybe, I'm hoping that gives us some chance to start something new. I don't know what that will be, though. And I'm always torn as someone who will never be bearing the brunt of as someone who won't be suffering in an increased way under Trump. It's very hard for me to get behind a kind of morally. It's hard for me to, I feel uneasy about embracing, what's the word? The opposite of incrementalism. Accelerationism. Because I don't feel like it's my place, kind of. But I don't know if it, and the other thing is I don't even know if it'll work. So I'm going to be just honest about not really knowing at all. But there's
Katie,
some
we're a
relief,
little long
maybe.
in the tooth. We're a little long in the tooth. We're not so old that we might not need an abortion someday.
Yeah, it's true. But like,
could be impacted.
I mean, yeah, but if we did, we would be able to, as of now, if we needed to, we would be able to travel.
No, that's true. I take your point. And I hear that argument a lot, Katie, but as you know, I've said to you, I've said on the show, I think that sometimes it is a sign of privilege to be willing to persist under the status quo. And part of what has emboldened me in my political positions is actually talking to people who do have a lot less security than I do, who are desperate to shake things up because the status quo is fundamentally failing them at the moment. So I'm not saying it's right one way or the other. I don't have, as much as some people would like to think that's the case, I don't have the ability to control the outcome of the election. But the fact of the matter is that it does seem to me that we are in a moment where there's an opportunity to make the case, at very least, that the Democratic Party has failed. It has failed its mandate. It cannot win. It has suffered a colossal loss, not just in the Electoral College, but also in the popular vote. And that, to the extent that arguments are being made right now about what direction the Democratic Party needs to move to change, what is, I think, broadly accepted as the party does need to change. And I would argue the party needs to be abandoned. And that does strike me, whether or not I could have created this opportunity or wanted this opportunity, the opportunity is here in front of us, and it would be negligent not to do something with it. What do you make of it, Malaika?
I think trying to address this at the federal level, especially the presidential level, when so much of America has been mesmerized by Trumpism, might not be a winning strategy, because his followers are going to go with him however inconsistent his views are. So I don't know if you can have necessarily a consistent message that he cannot, communicate to the people who are just fully MAGA. They're going to follow him wherever. If you try and present populist policies, some of them might say, well, we don't want these socialists winning. And these are Marxists that are trying to take our babies and our traditional households. So I think it's a little risky to try and focus on federal elections. But when you look at what has been happening, where progressive-ish policies, liberal, at the least, are winning on a local level, I think leftists have to refocus on how they're going to get people to think that what they have is attractive, regardless of what the Democratic Party does as a national leadership. On local levels, the Democratic Party is full of all kinds of folks. You've got socialists. You've got people who probably consider themselves communists. You've got all kinds of people at a local level who are Democrats who can have some wins in ways that really matter. Outside of, having a network or a engagement farming or the kind of media and social media infrastructure that the right has, I think you're going to have to get to the brass tacks, because we don't have the money for that. The left does not have the money to wage the kind of, I think, culture war at a mass media level. So where are those resources? So I think the left just has to think more about where to find those in a tangible, winnable way that might not be at the federal level yet. But if you can energize enough people, at some point, that might be effective.
So there's, I think, two related points in there that I think are really interesting. One about the media, because I've seen people talking about this, and there's this frustration about how much reach someone like Trump can get through alternative, independent, right media, and that the left doesn't have that. I want to be really clear about the fact that part of the reason that exists is because the liberals, where the money exists, where there's tons of money, where there's no money deficit, hate left independent media more than they hate establishment Republicans. A Kamala Harris, even a, oh, sorry, my light just went out. Because it's not plugged in. I'm so silly. Sorry. A Kamala Harris, or even like a Ayanna Pressley, I think you would find her more quickly going on a, Cheney's like a moderate conservative channel than you ever would find them going on a lefty outlet. AOC is going to go on Fox News before she ever goes on, I'm not even going to say the Young Turks these days even, right? And they're never going to come anywhere near someone like me. I was Bernie Sanders' national press secretary, and I promise you in 1,000,000 years, I will never talk to that man again for the rest of my life, unless we bump into each other in a hallway somewhere in Congress, right? So that they're creating this reality. And you also don't get the natural organic upswing of attention being paid for natural growth to these outlets because they're not fed by the mainstream politicos the way the right feeds its base. So that's part of the problem. But relatedly, I don't know that this culture issue is so much a consequence of a lack of podcasts and outreach, or just the which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Because I would like to point out that your point about local politics, I think, is right. And we saw that yesterday in the election. Sorry, we're recording on Wednesday. There were so many ballot measures that were quote unquote progressive, but just populist, that won in states where Donald Trump also won. Paid sick leave passed in Arkansas, Missouri, and what's NE?
Nebraska.
Sorry, NE, Nebraska, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. In Nebraska, all states that went to Trump. Minimum wage and tipped worker wages passed in 4 states, Arkansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Arizona, all went to Trump. Proposed minimum wage increases, I think failed. Is that where it failed in California and Massachusetts? Okay, ignore that one. But there was also got 57% of the vote in Florida, but didn't pass because there's a 60 vote threshold. But it doesn't mean that these things aren't popular. And all of those things, that reality got me thinking about 2020, when I remember harping on the fact that Florida passed a $15 minimum wage with 60% of the vote, even though Donald Trump obviously won in that state. So yes, there's like a misogynistic culture, and there's the guy that made the Puerto Rico joke at Madison Square Garden. All of that stuff is really real and out there. But when you have a Democratic Party who won't even just loudly run on a $15 minimum wage, Kamala Harris, forget Medicare for all, forget Gaza, forget all these things I care deeply about. If I want to see the alternate reality where Kamala Harris just became the nominee and said, if there's one goddamn thing I do, I'm going to raise the minimum wage. It is a travesty that we live in a country where we haven't had a minimum wage raise since 2009, and people are suffering. And gosh darn it, over my dead body, I'm gonna raise your wages. Do you know what state that was really crucial in this election still has a federal minimum wage? Pennsylvania.
Wow.
How many people in Pennsylvania earning $7.25 an hour might have been inclined to get out and vote instead of her talking about fracking, where there's only like 17,000 fracking jobs in the state? So yes, I agree with you broadly, Malaika, but I also am not so quick to be like, what we're doing has failed, or like there's some like really colossal messaging problem in selling progressivism to the public. Not that you were saying that. Not that you're saying that.
I'm saying that I think it's hard to sell it on a national level when there are going to be so many resources when it comes to federal elections. Like Kate said, I think a lot, or Zaid said, a lot of the advertisement he was getting was about her immigration. In Wisconsin as a swing state, it was about the fact that she was a border czar and she's letting all these immigrants in. So at a federal level, when you've got millions upon millions of dollars that are focused on like getting like obliterating the airwaves with that kind of messaging, I think we got to be a little bit under the radar with elections that aren't going to cause as much, getting that kind of attention and that kind of reactionary messaging at the federal level. I think people would accept it just in a different form. I think is what I'm saying. It's not that, of course, I think people will accept it because I brought up the fact that these messages have worked on a local level. I just think that the apparatus that the way that we're trying to fight on a federal level, we're outmatched. So what you asked what the left does. I know what the left can do. Sure, there's all kinds of things that liberals can do, but what can the left do without that kind of formidable, revenue to challenge it?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, there is something to messaging, but I think you're right that it's a bigger problem that we do. I mean, national and federal issues are much sexier than like boring local wonky races,
also,
but
guys,
they are really important.
We're talking about a federal election because yesterday was the presidential election.
No, of course, but I mean, no.
Can we have? I know the left always likes to be like electoral politics isn't that important. We all can agree. They are important, but it is the day after election day. Are we allowed to talk about the presidential election the day after?
No one's saying that it's like, Brie, you should have had a panel on local state senate races. No, obviously, I'm saying in general. I don't care. It's hard for me to care about local things, even though I think it's true that is where a lot of the change is going to happen. We have to try to figure out how to make that exciting and sexy. I'm not interested in that at all on in terms of my natural inclination or where my curiosity lies. So we do have, I think it's on Malaika can do it because Malaika's a great ambassador for so many things. And you should do a tour.
What's next? Like we know, the election was yesterday, but you asked what's next? Like what does the left do next? I mean, we won't have another federal election for another 4 years. So what do we do in between that? There's all kinds of to excite people with.
But there's
what do you think? I think that you maybe have an idea, Briahna. I'm going to ask you, pretend I'm the host. What's next, Briahna?
I think there's a contradiction between people being, not you guys, but you all know how these conversations go on the left. If I say vote green or vote for Marianne at a primary or vote for Bernie, it's, you guys only roll around every 4 years. But if it's between the 4 years, we also still have to talk about the party and building the candidate and building the foundation for the next, federal election 4 years from now if we want to have more of an impact in it. And that doesn't mean to the exclusion of working on a local level, obviously. But yes, you still have to keep talking about electoral politics between the election cycles if you don't want to be confronted with the often bad faith, I think, accusation that you've only turned up every 4 years to just put your name on a ballot and run. So I'm really interested in it. I'm planning to have some guests coming up shortly from the Green Party.
He's like, not you bums. I'm just kidding.
No, but obviously you guys aren't Green Party
apparatchiks.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll have some of them on to talk about how they think things could have been done differently.
But what do you think comes next, Brie? Like what should come next?
I think the next year, if 2016 is any indication, is going to be a battleground for what direction the Democratic Party should move in. And my feeling is that we should fight that battle with an eye toward the public and less toward convincing James Carville of anything, right? Bill Maher, I could write a script for what they're gonna say in a few days, right? They're gonna basically say some version of what Richie Torres said, which is that a woman who's never uttered the words defund the police in her life somehow lost the election because she wanted to defund the police. They're gonna say that somehow it's trans people's fault, even though Kamala Harris dutifully threw trans people under the bus.
Right, yeah.
They're gonna.
You saw Joe, someone on Morning Joe already said that, right? I think it was actually Joe himself.
I did. We should insert that clip here. 100%.
The Washington Post, Matt Bai, writes in part, I do think the prosecutions fed a narrative of Trump as a victim. I also think Democrats dug themselves into a hole on cultural issues and identity politics. Trump's vicious transgender ad in the closing weeks, she's for they, them, he's for you, was probably the most effective of the cycle. I think that probably landed with a lot of traditionally Democratic voters who feel like the party is consumed with the cultural issues, while the economic issues don't really change. I think people needed a reason to feel good and hopeful about voting for her, and absent that, a lot of frustrated voters apparently decided to go with the guy who wants to burn it all down.
Let's dig a little deeper, because you have that stacked on top of what happened on college campuses this fall, stacked on top of what's been happening on college campuses over the past 4 or 5 years. I have said this on the air, and every time I've said it, people said, oh, you're just saying that because you're a white conservative. No, I'm just saying it because every Democrat that we have ever sat down with dinner with over the past 5 years who have kids that go to colleges say their kids are afraid to speak in class because they'll be canceled. Let me say that again. And they're all Democrats. Everybody that we've had dinner with, if they have a kid in college, you can go, how are the Red Sox going? Yeah, fine. Yeah. Sitting there eating. Beautiful day today, wasn't it? Yeah. You know, my daughter at University of Virginia, she's afraid to raise her hand in class because if she says something that's politically incorrect, she will immediately be canceled. She'll be shunned from class. She'll be destroyed in social media by noon. So they just sit in class quiet. Now, if any of you, which camera? Give me a camera to look at. Boom! Oh, look at that one. If any of you out there say, oh, that's just like a conservative, white, Southern guy, da-da-da, that's what you're losing. That's what you're losing. Because that's what I heard. And I didn't hear it from Republicans. I didn't hear it from Trumpers. I heard it from Democrats over the past 3 or 4 years. Their kids were afraid to talk in class and say something unpopular because they would be canceled. And it's an epidemic. Willie will tell you it happens in New York City schools. It happens in colleges. And all of this adds up to people going, come on, this is crazy. And Mike, it's having an impact from, again, the trans ad to, the athletics. And by the way, as we've said on the show 1,000 times, Democrats should be smarter on the women's athletics thing. 85% of Americans oppose men transitioning after puberty and competing against women. And I'm not just saying this the day after the election. I've been saying this for years. This is not a hard call. You can show compassion. And you can show grace. And as the Republican governor of Utah said, let's figure out a way to do this. But one way we don't do this is by allowing men who transition after puberty competing against young girls who have been working their entire lives to be as good as they can be. And then they get destroyed in the pool, on the track, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And I saw, frankly, Simone Sanders calling, was it Donnie Deutsch out for suggesting that it was like cultural issues or like, something, I'm paraphrasing, but basically wokeism that caused this loss.
A lot of young people are also fed up with very super progressive attitudes. I think the Democrats, Joe, going back to your initial question, and you may disagree with this, I think they need to move to the center. I think the
center. What does that mean, though? When you say they need to move to the center, what do they need? Are you saying that they should not support trans people? Like, let's just be specific, because that's what the ads are doing. So if the analysis and the immediate aftermath is they have to move to the center, I mean, what is the center? Because I disagree that is it, but I want to hear what is the center? Because you're not the only person, to be clear, I've heard say that. Yeah. I've heard, the Democrats have been in my phone this morning.
The center are the people I described before. I'm not even talking about an issue. We can talk about issues. The people I described before who bounce back and forth, who play between the 45-yard lines, that tends to win elections. If you look historically where it is. So that's my feeling. And we can agree to disagree.
All right. So we also have with us U.S. Special Correspondent for BBC.
I think, none of that is true. I have a lot of disagreements with Simone Sanders, but I think that she's right to bristle at that being the knee-jerk reaction. But what those people are doing is making the case for their ideological priors. When the left makes their case for their ideological priors, we're like told, oh no, we're making, we're just biased and we're not actually listening to the facts on the ground. What I want to say is that my ideological priors are not ideological priors. They're values, morals, beliefs, and they also happen to be popular. And so I think that we should be really focused on using this moment to demonstrate how little the Democratic Party cares about winning, cares about saving the public from fascism, cares about actually uplifting poor and working people in this country, and is very willing to take advice that would throw them under the bus and basically become a Republican light party. And that is exactly the reason that people should invest in alternative third parties. Sorry, Malaika, did you?
Oh, no, keep going. Or Malaika, you go.
Do you have to run? Sorry, you're on mute, Malaika.
Yeah, I think I'm super late. I am supposed to be interviewing this woman. From
Go ahead.
So
thank you so much for being here.
Too.
Yes, Katie.
Tell us.
Hang out.
Where are you, by the way, now physically?
Wisconsin.
Okay. Yeah. Great.
Tell us about your book before you go, Malaika.
Oh, yeah. Which I have to have you on.
So I wrote It's Not You, It's Capitalism, Why It's Time to Break Up and How to Move On precisely for this moment, because we see that both political parties have been failing the working class. And instead of really having the language to identify what's really happening, a lot of folks are blaming women, they're blaming immigrants, they're blaming Black people, they're blaming whoever they can instead of these corporate donors, the big businesses, the people who have eroded the rights of workers for the last 60 years. And so I wanted to do it in an approachable way, something that would be easy to read, as it turns out. And I geared it towards Gen Z and millennials. As it turns out, a lot of Gen Z doesn't read. So I think this is why.
Are you going to TikTok it up? Just TikTok it.
It's so cute though. Like the graphics and stuff. Can you see that? It's like really, really
it is. It's great.
Fun to read.
Thank you. But
Wait, why don't you do an audiobook? Well, why don't you do an audiobook?
I've got one.
Oh, good. Did you read it? Did you do it?
Yeah,
like, is it your voice?
Oh, good.
It. Amazing. Okay, great.
Yes, and so
it's a great book.
Is a toxic partner that we need to break up with, and how do we get that message out if people are not reading the stuff? So we got to, as leftists, as socialists like myself, we got to figure out exactly how to do that. And that's basically it. It came out.
All right.
I know.
Fantastic.
And it's perfect timing because I think it came out right when when Israel stuff was happening, right? So I kept wanting to have you on, and now that, Israel stuff is still happening, but it's obviously like, this is a time that we really need to reflect on how breaking up with capitalism will help. Yeah. And Malaika does amazing work, and her reporting is so important. And she's like, I would love if more people did the time for reporting that. Oh, I sound like such a scold. Malaika does great work, and it's a very important voice. Yeah.
Thank you. Speaking of, I've got to go talk to one of these, Black working class women that their voices and narratives have been erased by both parties. So it was great to join you all.
Thank you so much, Malaika. All right, talk soon.
Take care.
Bria, I have one thing I wanted to read to you from Bernie Sanders. Where is this? Bernard, in statement issued as Harris is about to give her concession speech. So this is something that Nicholas Wu, who is at Politico, who's a journalist, he tweeted this out at 4:04 p.m. So Bernie Sanders, in statement issued as Harris is about to give her concession speech. It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. And, that's just like one line from it. But
yeah. So Katie, now that it's just us, obviously I reached out to you first to do this episode, originally before deciding that it could be benefit from having a panel, when I saw some of the tweets and takes from the two other panelists and invited them on. But when we chatted yesterday, we were both talking about some ambivalent feelings about what sort of outcome would be sort of good for the left. And, I wondered, revisiting it now that we know the outcome, how you are feeling about how it all went down. What would have been the worst possible outcome in your mind? Or maybe we got it.
It's interesting. I'm torn because I think back to the episode I did with you and Fouad Dakwar, and shout out to Fouad. Everyone should book him on their show because he's great. He's actually like a musical theater writer and Palestinian American. He has a great show called Fouad of Nazareth, but he's also incredibly smart and insightful. But, you know, it was interesting because I remember saying to you, and I make this point all the time, like, don't blame Jill Stein because her voters would not have voted for the Democratic nominee anyway. And you kind of said, no, I want them to blame. Like, I want us to be us being Jill Stein voters. I want us to be the reason that they lose. And I have to admit, like, I always play defense on this issue because one thing, it's not true. So it's not true. And if Democrats want to learn why they're losing, they need to look at why they're losing instead of just blaming third party people as spoilers. But, you know, I'm torn because I would have loved do we know what percentage they got, the Greens?
I don't think we know yet because it's the popular vote.
Right.
I meant to mention this earlier. The one sort of bit of information that we had coming out of Dearborn showed that Trump took the most votes with about, this is off the top of my head, I'm sorry, about 250. Jill Stein was second with, I think, like 160, 70, something like that. And then Kamala Harris was far behind with about 50 votes in this one Dearborn precinct. So in the Arab American community, at least, it does seem like the polls sort of bore out her popularity. But unfortunately, not all communities were as principled in their voting as Muslim and Arab Americans.
Yeah.
So
it's funny. Did you see these tweets that was like Kamala Harris cost Jill Stein the election?
Yeah. I think I liked and retweeted one or two of those.
But, you know, that I feel conflicted because in some ways I'm like, no, you do not get to put this on Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, and third parties voters because that's not what happens. I mean, two reasons. One is it's not that, but for Stein, these people would have voted for Hillary. I mean, sorry, same thing, voted for Kamala. But the other thing is the numbers just don't bear it out, right? If you take their numbers, even assuming under the fallacy that all these people would have, but for Stein, voted for Kamala, the numbers still don't give the race to Kamala. So in a way, I'm relieved because I'm like, okay, these people won't be vilified. But I'm also, it would have been nice to see the Dems it would have been nice in some way to see the Dems learn, you know, F around and find out, as Larry Krasner said like 17 times in a speech the other day. But the problem is they wouldn't have learned the lesson. And as you're saying, Brie, it's like they're not going to learn. This is about this is about third party supporters making the case to the people, not making the case to the Democrats. I mean, I don't know. What do you think the worst case scenario would have been? Like, you probably think it would have been Kamala winning, right?
I think the worst case scenario is Kamala winning and a poor third party showing.
Right.
That's the worst combo.
Right.
The best combo is a strong third party showing. I confess, I don't know. The number one best thing for me is the third party having a strong showing. But absent the third party having a good showing, which doesn't look, you know, we'll see what happens, but it doesn't look it was especially strong, I think, in this moment. I think the worst outcome is Kamala Harris winning, there being no strong third party and no accountability for not moving an inch on Gaza, not to mention all the other domestic issues, and the Democratic Party having a mandate to do a literal genocide. I know that might be a controversial take, but I think the left party, the most left major party in the strongest country, richest, most militarily mighty country in the world, having a mandate to facilitate a genocide is one of the worst things that could happen.
Right.
In the world.
Yes.
The downstream implications of that put ice in my veins. So I'm sorry, I'm glad that didn't happen. Now, there's a world where a big Green Party showing and Kamala still winning still gives us the grist to like make the argument and we can build the party, and that's a perfectly fine outcome as well. But if it's, you know, if it's not going to be that, I don't want us to live in a world where Democrats feel like they can wage a genocide and kill upward of 200,000 people with impunity, say I am speaking,
right,
and there be no consequences.
But here's my question, and I haven't looked at the data enough because, first of all, it's not all in, but also, as I said, I'm sick, and so I've been sleeping incredibly late. So my apologies for being derelict on that. You can cut this out so I don't look like a total,
No, I didn't know what NE stands for with respect to states. So I'm getting the Dullard Prize for this podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, you're taking one for the team. No, I just don't know how much, and I see a lot of Palestinians saying like, we did it. This is for you, Rafat, and Palestine supporters saying that. Actually, that's the person I saw do that was this Palestine supporter. And I don't know how much this reminds me of when Joe Biden stepped down and was replaced by Kamala Harris. A lot of people were like, everyone take stock of this victory. We did this because of our organizing around Palestine. And I tweeted out like, sorry, that this is not about Palestine. Like Joe Biden stepped down because he couldn't form a complete sentence. And I got some pushback from like progressives who were like, you should be framing this as a victory. And there is something, there's value in like shaping reality, I guess, and self-fulfilling prophecies and stuff. But I also thought we needed to be clear-eyed about what had happened. And I feel like we're maybe in this moment because it made a difference, but I don't know if it made the difference. And maybe that's not the most important thing. Maybe it's just important to show that people voted for their principles. But I would have loved for it to have been, but I'm torn because of like the vitriol coming from Democrats too against Palestinian people. Like I didn't want them to wake up with people, taking it all out on Palestinians, which they are anyway, even though it doesn't look like that was the cause of it.
It's not, look, I don't want anybody to suffer the slings and arrows of the internet, as I'm very familiar. So I won't speak for them, but I'll speak for myself. I am glad to see that. I want the blame. I welcome their hatred because the worst case scenario is to feel disempowered. The worst case scenario is to be below political notice. Right. People are losing their mind about Latino vote, which is, as I understand it, historically high for Republicans since 1976 or something like that. ABC News said this is the biggest Latino turnout in favor of Republicans since 1976. As a Black person, though, I'm jealous. Just like as a Black person, I'm jealous of what we saw out of Muslim voters in the Midwest and in Georgia, right? The squeaky wheel gets the grease, and your commitment to the Democratic Party without condition is a sentence for irrelevance. If people aren't bad at you, if people aren't yelling at you, if people aren't agitated, then it's because you're irrelevant. The fact that the Democratic Party for the first time issued attack ads against Jill Stein is a sign of the threat that the Green Party actually demonstrated in this election cycle and how close this race was and how much they needed all of those votes.
Right.
And I relish that. I mean, it doesn't feel good. I'm not like, do I not bleed? Yes. Like I'm a human being, but I know that that's what it's going to take a lot worse than that. It's going to get a lot worse than that. So, yes, it's tough. I'm sorry if you are Palestinian or if you are generally Arab or Muslim and you're catching a lot of flack today. You will be blamed. The left will be blamed. Black people will be blamed. Latinos will be blamed. And as that blame game happens and Democrats wish for you to be deported and for your home cities to be turned into parking lots in Gaza or Lebanon, remember that. Remember your relationship to that party and the people who are saying that about you, and let that inform your political decisions going forward.
Yeah. And also, Brie, I'm worried about the people who are saying, well, it turns out half of this country, even though half of the country doesn't even vote, but you get Julia Yaffe saying, it turns out half of this country supports fascism and we're going to have to reckon with that. Which is so funny. Someone wrote in the chat, in the comments, like, don't you support Israel? Of course she does. She supports fascism. But also, that's wrong. Like, even if everyone who's voted for Trump voted for that reason, it's not half the country, right? But that I'm also afraid of that. I mean, people are just saying the takeaway is people are racist, homophobes, transphobes, misogynists. And that's not, that ain't it. I mean, those things exist. They exist more than I'd like them to exist. But if your takeaway is that that's really what drove Trump voters, and yeah, it drives some Trump voters, I'm not going to lie. And I think that Trump's rhetoric is destructive. I mean, I think that often the media and the elites focus too much on rhetoric and not enough on policy. But I also I think that sometimes the leftists like us can be dismissive of the power of rhetoric in exciting people towards violence. But yeah, I'm not saying you do that, but I do think that.
Here's one thing I will say to that, and it relates to, I think, a point Malaika was making just before she left. I'm not a prophet. I can't say anything for sure. This is just my instinct. And because so little has been tried on the left, I have very little in terms of data points to go off of. But my observation of Donald Trump is that, people are like, oh, why doesn't anything stick to him? And we were talking about this a little bit, like he's able to be so inconsistent, so hypocritical, like, something I completely forgot about, all of those criminal cases that he's a part of, like all of that went out the window. No one's even talked about that in months. Like, why is that? Why is that? I believe that part of why that is that Donald Trump doesn't spend time engaging and apologizing. He has an affirmative case that he's making over here. He's already moved on. And his affirmative case is sexy and interesting and appealing to those folks that you want to be dissuaded from supporting him because of the negative case that you're making over here. And I would like to see a world where the left, instead of constantly wanting to be like, oh, well, sorry if I offended you by liking a trans person, blah, 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 and did all of that like shuffling and pussyfooting around every time that they're confronted with the fact that somebody in the world doesn't agree with one of their opinions. Oh, sorry, I don't actually mean tax the rich. We're just going to tax 2 cents on every dollar, whatever the hell Elizabeth Warren started talking about. If they just said, I'm ignoring this, and I'm going to go over here and keep talking about these banger issues for me, like a living wage, like Medicare for all. I don't have time to debate with you about whatever wokeism that you think is a problem. The people who hate wokeness are going to be too distracted with how much money I'm going to put in their bank account by taking away the obligation to pay $20,000 a year on average for families' health insurance.
Right.
Like, you're going to seem petty and small and ridiculous being over there talking about Bud Light cans when we're over here talking about saving your life.
Right.
Three more black soldiers? Sorry, I think it's relevant that they're black. Were just killed in the Middle East. Reservists. What can you imagine a world where Kamala Harris made a pitch to Black American about how pathetic it is that we have to be, how disgusting and demoralizing and demeaning it is that minorities, because they're disproportionately low income, are disproportionately enrolled in the military so they can get health care and college paid for, so they can be sent over there and die for a bunch of Israelis who get free health care,
right,
substantially on the American dime. Yeah. Like, how about that as a pitch to Black Americans instead of crypto? To be a leftist is to have every persuasive argument in the world at your fingertips. To be a liberal, you have a lot of those arguments ostensibly at your fingertips. Again, a $15 minimum wage is not some highfalutin lefty idea.
Right.
But they don't do it. So I believe there's a lot of potential for the candidate that comes along who isn't afraid of their own shadow,
right,
and who genuinely believes in the fact that the things that they're prescribing are beneficial and is willing to take the case to the people. That's the other thing I'll just say. Democrats fundamentally have abandoned persuasion. They don't think it exists. They think if they poll test something and a poll's wrong, you just shouldn't talk about it. But the reality is they do persuasion every election cycle. They persuade Democrats out of their progressive positions. Approximately a 20-point swing to the right on a fracking ban because of the way Joe Biden was campaigning on it in 2020. They talked people out of Black Lives Mattering. We are better off without a Democratic Party. And that is why I feel the way I feel about the election yesterday.
All right. Well, thank you, Bri, for your clear-eyed analysis. I'm sorry I can be, it must be annoying for me to be so ambivalent. And not Oh yeah, no. Well, partly is because I have to go to do do useful idiots. But yeah.
Okay, please do go.
But also
Thank
because
you so much.
And I could do this for all night, obviously.
It's true. We could.
Fun, yeah.
You're my favorite, Katie. Thank you so much. Do you want to tell the audience where they can find, if they don't already know, you and your work on the internet and beyond?
Yes, of course. Useful. Well, there's Useful Idiots, but there's also the Katie Halper Show. So that's youtube.com/the Katie Halper Show and patreon.com/the Katie Halper Show, and then wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Excellent. Amazing. Thank you, Katie. Thank you to all of the listeners.
One more thing.
Go ahead.
Can I just plug one more thing? I'm working on a very, I think, exciting documentary about Holocaust survivors who are speaking out against the Gaza genocide. So stay tuned for that, including one of the characters is this amazing son of a survivor. He's part of this group called Holocaust Survivors and their Descendants Against the Genocide. This guy, his name is Chaim Brashith, who you may want to interview. He's the author of a great book called An Army Like No Other about the IDF. He's the son of Holocaust survivors who weighed like 70 pounds when their camps were liberated. And fascinating story. His father refused to serve in the Israeli army when they moved to Israel, and they put him in jail for 6 weeks. And then he's like, fine, I just won't be armed. So he was a medic. He was arrested in London giving a speech at a Palestine solidarity protest. So he's one of the characters in the documentary. Anyway.
Fascinating. Yeah. Please do share his contact information. I'd love to talk to him. Thank you again, Katie. Thank you to the audience for listening. You know, you can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast at patreon.com/Bad Faith Podcast that drops on Monday with visuals and audio. And additionally, as I alluded to earlier, I have a new Substack called Briefly, where you can get the radars you're used to from Rising. They're now called debriefs. Everything is free so far over, so go ahead and subscribe and sign up for those. But eventually, to pay for production costs, which I'm currently just paying for out of pocket, I'm going to have to implement a paywall. So if you do subscribe, I might not have to. So consider becoming a paid subscriber over there on Substack as well. Thanks for listening. And as always, take care of yourselves. And please do keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.